Right. Back to you, Dr. James Kim. Like what we were discussing about, how different is this attitude compared to North Korea in the previous sessions?
I think North Korea has been fairly consistent in expressing its desire to engage both South Korea and the United States. And they've not changed that since they've made that declaration at the beginning of this year. So all in all, I think it's fairly consistent. The approach also is as we expected, that on the denuclearization front, they will move very carefully and very slowly. There's some skepticism whether they would even be willing to move at all on that issue. So again, there isn't really much of a change here. Where we see the big changes and shifts is on the part of the United States. Recall that it was President Trump that canceled Secretary Pompeo's trip to North Korea last month via tweet. Again, that's another surprise. Recall also right before the Singapore summit, he issued an announcement with a letter that said that he's canceling the talks, and then that was back on again. So where we see the shifts and swings, we see mostly coming from Washington. And North Korea has been fairly consistent in their approach to all of this.
So with their consistency, do you think they're winning some support from the rest of the world as opposed to the international community seeing them as a very difficult menace to deal with in the past?
Well, I think that the world appreciates the fact that the tensions are down and we're no longer at the place that we were pre-January of this year. Again, that has to do with North Korea's change in its approach by ending all provocations since late last year and declaring that they now want to engage. You know, it's very difficult to say because it takes two to dance, and United States have to want to play along with this. If they don't, then we could be in a very difficult position like we were last year.
Right, restarting talks with the U.S. seems to be a main focus. The media around the world was expecting that President Moon Jae-in's shoulder is heavy with the responsibility of igniting the talks again. Do you think North Korea was focused on that same goal as well, even before the summit began?
I think that desire was definitely there. I think they're showing that here with this agreement. The wording in the agreement is a bit more specific. And as Dr. Hu alluded to earlier in the discussion, the ball seems to be now on the U.S. court. And the question is whether the summit will take place between Kim Jong-un and Donald Trump before the end of this year. And if so, what will come out of that meeting?
What about Washington's continued demand for a list of inventory or nuclear arsenal and inspections to verify such inventory?
So, U.S. has intel on the North Korean nuclear program, but it is a limited intel. And so the reason why they're asking for this information is twofold. First, the United States wants to learn more about North Korean nuclear program. So the question here is, will North Korea be able to provide any information that the U.S. does not have on its nuclear program, number one. Number two, as I've said before, U.S. has some information and intelligence on the nuclear program. If North Korea is really genuine about bargaining in good faith with the United States on this issue, then they should be forthcoming about all the information that the United States has. So this is a test. It's a way to test North Korea's seriousness and at the same time for the United States to be able to obtain some additional information about the program it does not know of. And it's part of the reason why they've set it up this way. Now, it seems North Korea doesn't want to play along with this game. And they've sort of turned to their own approach to this issue and the way that they want to move ahead. It'll be interesting to see how President Trump responds, but he's already responded with a tweet, and it seems very positive. The question is, and we've seen these kinds of moves before, and the meetings happen. The question is whether we see actual action on the ground at the working level, and we see forward movement there.
Well, the previous summit between the leaders of Washington and Pyongyang, they did not really draw a positive response. It seemed like a very superficial meet and greet without any substance. So there must be a lot of pressure on the part of President Donald Trump to deliver something the next time they meet.
I think the pressure is mostly on, at the moment, also on Donald Trump, but everybody here. Less so on Kim Jong-un, definitely on President Moon's part, because there's more at stake for him. But it'll be interesting to see what they come up with at the next meeting. But President Trump seems to take a sort of an approach here that says, well, we're moving forward in his view in substantive way on denuclearization, and he hasn't gone back to the fire and fury rhetoric that he was on last year. So these are all hopeful signs. Even though at the working level things aren't going as smoothly, the rhetoric and the military posturing is not there. So we're in a much better place in terms of when we're talking about and thinking about tensions on the peninsula. This is a lot better than where we were last year.
We're going to go back to some of the joint projects that left a bad taste in some business communities' mind, the Kaesong Industrial Park and, of course, the Mount Kumgang tour. They're thinking about resuming it, reopening it. And, of course, the highlight there in bold would be as soon as conditions are met. What are your prospects for these ventures regaining the trust of the people and the business investors?
Well, first and foremost, the sanctions have to be lifted. If not, you have to have some exceptions to the existing sanctions arrangement for these programs to proceed in a meaningful way. It could be that the United States could work out some kind of a deal with North Korea with certain timelines and in terms of how they're going to stage the reduction of sanctions on these fronts. But again, without any movement on sanctions, it's difficult for me to see how these programs will resume, because there has to be some kind of financial transaction that follows through with reopening of Kaesong and Mount Kumgang. And that means that banks will be involved. And if these banks are doing business in the United States, they are vulnerable to sanctions pressure. And so if there's some other way to do this without involving the banks, then there could be a solution. But it's difficult for me to see how that would be possible.
Right, one very visible stumbling block there, sanctions, not just regaining the trust of people who had these projects put on pause because of inter-Korean relations. Now, going back to, speaking of inter-Korean relations, Ji-won, going back to some of the details of the programs that we've had up to this day and what we can expect in the near coming hours, I believe there's a dinner that's probably going on right now.
Yes, Daniel, we believe the South Korean first couple is having their dinner with the North Korean leader, and it's from what we heard earlier in the day, it is at the Daedonggang seafood restaurant. It was built just 2 months ago, and it's a local restaurant, but it's one of the high quality ones. It was named and inspected directly by North Korean leader Kim Jong-un himself. He said he wants this restaurant to be another symbolic restaurant that represents Pyongyang, like the Ongyugan does, and that is the footage of Ongyugan. It's where the two Korean leaders had their lunch today. And so, to tell you more about this Daedonggang seafood restaurant where they are currently likely to be having their dinner, North Korean leader Kim Jong-un said that restaurant is another one where North Korean workers can provide a chance for locals to enjoy international food and also taste the taste buds of foreign visitors to the country as well. And we believe that this restaurant was chosen for one of the reasons, for South Korean Moon Jae-in's routine of going to these local restaurants when he goes to state visits outside of the country. he also went to a local restaurant back when he was visiting China.
Right. Yongbyon, of course, is a name that's been very familiar with South Koreans because of the fact that they had a chef and a noodle-making machine delivered to the site of the first summit between the two leaders, and it just underlines how much President Moon Jae-in loves naengmyeon, the Korean cold noodle dish, and we won't be surprised if they hold another meal there before he departs Pyongyang.
It was actually called a naengmyeon diplomacy, yes, because the two leaders having naengmyeon at the Panmunjom summit was a big surprise to many, and so a lot of South Koreans, I believe, went to have naengmyeon for dinner that day.
And we're getting some more recent footage from Yongbyon. I'm sure this venue has been covered extensively in various PR footages, but this time this one is focused on the most recent one where the two leaders are sitting down with the North Korean leader Kim Jong-un not wearing glasses this time, interestingly, to have a closer look and an eye-to-eye contact with South Korean counterpart Moon Jae-in there. Also interesting development is that there were a lot of talks about will it be too risky to take part as an audience in the mass games. What's your take on that, Dr. James Kim? It's seen originally as a form of propaganda with a lot of aggressive rhetoric towards the outside world in the past. Of course, there were some recent changes made.
You know, with North Korea, it's difficult to avoid any kind of rhetoric with propaganda. So I think anything involving North Korea and any cultural events, that's something that comes par for the course. And you have to take it as part of the package. There's discussions not only for the mass games, but moving on, other kinds of cultural exchanges, especially on the sporting side, right? The 2020 Summer Games, for instance. And I think these kinds of sports diplomacy overall is one way to break the ice at the people-to-people level. And this goes beyond simply interactions at the elite level between two governments, because all the changes that really matter happen at the ground level, at the level of the regular people. And so, you know, it's kind of surprising to me that we would have the kind of expansive people-to-people interaction and cultural exchanges and sporting exchanges than what we've seen in the past. We've had some in the past, but if we're thinking about deepening it and broadening it, I would be very surprised in some ways, because this cultural and ideological threats to the regime's ideology would be a concern for the North Korean regime. And if they're making changes there on that front, it seems to show some progress in thinking.
Willingness to embrace something from the outside, not afraid of shedding some of its traditional elements.
Opening up, right.
There were stories about how watching K-pop or K-drama materials in North Korea could have been a very strong offense at one point.
Right. And so if we're seeing those changes on those fronts, I think these are some meaningful changes that we shouldn't underestimate and that we should encourage.
Right. Speaking of the mass games, Juwon, I understand we have a new program set up by Kim Jong-un. It's very different from the ones held in the past.
Yes, Daniel, we don't know what exactly the program, how the program has been renewed, but we know it was introduced again. It was reintroduced on September 9th. That's just a few weeks ago, on the 70th anniversary of the regime's founding. Now this, as you said with Dr. Kim, is it could be a very sensitive performance, as it has a lot of chants that promotes the North Korean regime.
Right, it could be something that is seen as a glorification of what North Korea's previous regime stands for. But I understand there were many changes made to show various economic progress, like using drones during the programs, and various technological aspects were implemented and infused to the performance. Also, less labor-intensive gymnastics, but more fireworks and even a media wall or a flashcard wall that shows President Moon Jae-in on it as well.
Yes, after following the 5-year hiatus, we are expected to see some glowing drones, lasers, and stadium-sized gymnastics shows designed to glorify the country.
Right, and maybe they were watching the Pyeongchang Winter Olympics opening and closing ceremonies, and I believe some of the most memorable bits were the ones involving the drones and the laser shows. Speaking of culture, the sports exchanges, they have been very successful and they're looking forward to doing more of it. Will we see any bumps along the way in terms of the team-ups? Because some of the teams that's been working with the South Korean athletes exclusively, they're not very open to the idea of sudden changes last minute.
Yeah, so I think early planning here is going to be important. Again, it could be that we have the 2020 Summer Games set up and we might have won the bidding. But if the geopolitical conditions have changed at that point in time, because we're a long way, it's still 2 years we're talking about, but it's still a long way from where we are now, you know, when moving beyond. But again, things can be very unstable. And if it changes very quickly, then it will get in the way of athletes performing. But so planning here is going to be critical. How the two countries coordinate on those fronts will be important. Hopefully things will be okay and we won't have any sudden changes in the geopolitical environment. So let's see. I'm still unclear and it's difficult to predict even what's going to happen next month.
Well, North Korea did not have a very stellar track record, but based on if you were to start clean slate from the first day of this year with the declaration, the announcement made by the North Korean leader during his January 1st New Year's speech, it's been consistent so far in terms of not carrying out any provocative actions and working towards turning over a new leaf. Let's take a look at some of the military tensions that's going to be relieved somewhat with the details that's been discussed during the Inter-Korean forming an Inter-Korean Joint Military Committee is a very big, bold highlight among the subjects that were covered.
That's right. The Inter-Korean Joint Military Committee, along with some of the details that are coming out on the side agreement on the military domain from this summit. What I thought was very impressionable for me was the agreement that by November of this year, they will create a arms-free zone at land, air, and sea to lessen the likelihood of accidental engagement, military engagement of some kind between North and South Korea. And that means pulling out certain kinds of southern facilities along the DMZ, having a no-fly zone in certain areas, and not having any battleships or naval ships in certain areas at sea. So these are substantively very meaningful measures. They're confidence-building measures because at the same time you're opening up a committee, you're institutionalizing that military-to-military interaction between North and South Korea. So from the government's peace-promoting standpoint, from that point of view, I think this is a very substantial development, and it's one that overall people will look at as a positive thing, not only for South Koreans, but also for foreign investors as well, who have a keen eye on these kinds of issues. They care about provocations and the impact on the markets. So these are very, very good developments overall.
So do you think there's a fresh start in setting up protocol or enhancing consultation prior to any military activity work out in the long run?
Well, we'll have to wait and see how this works out at the working level. But the idea is more substantial. It's more specific than what we've seen in the past. I wouldn't downplay its importance in terms of decreasing military tensions.
Right. We can take the cue from how seriously devoted to the military tension, relieving military tension, the two sides are. We've had a 17-hour marathon working level military discussions before the summit.
That's right.
In terms of hot air balloon mentioned in the agreements, is it geared towards propaganda leaflets?
Yeah. Well, again, I think I think anything that reduces any misunderstanding between North and South Korea is a positive thing for reducing tensions. And this goes all under the heading of promoting peace on the peninsula, which, it's interestingly enough, it's being handled separately from the nuclear issue. And is this a signal by the two Koreas that regardless of how the nuclear issue gets handled, that we're going to press ahead with peace-promoting measures? And so nuclear issue is an issue that is going to be outside of what the two Koreas can talk about. It's more an issue that needs to be handled between North Korea and the United States. Or is this an approach that says, let's go with the lower hanging fruits first and address the issue of peace first, and this is the issue, if we could move ahead in a constructive way, then we could tackle the nuclear issue. I don't know what the approach is here, but it certainly is clear to me that these two issues are being looked at from two different points of view, and they're not necessarily the same thing as far as the agreement and the diplomacy is concerned.